The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
The city of Boston is experiencing climate change on a daily basis, and they're doing something about it. Through their Climate Ready Boston initiative, they're taking action to build urban resiliency. Our guests today are passionate about integrating nature-based solutions into resilience projects to help address coastal and inland flooding in Boston and beyond. Welcome to Season 6, Episode 2 of the EWN Podcast. My Engineering with Nature co-host today is Andrew McQueen. Andrew's a research biologist in the Environmental Laboratory of the Engineering Research Development Center of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Hey, welcome, Andrew.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. Excited to be here.
Andrew, I'd like to ask you to introduce our guest, Joe Christo, who's the managing director of the Stone Living Lab in Boston.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the Stone Living Lab's mission is to conduct transformative outreach to make vulnerable regions adaptive to climate change while enhancing natural and built environments. And so I first met Joe as we were preparing for Stone Living Lab's first in-person conference. And so I was on the organizing committee with Joe and had an opportunity to chat with him there. And at that conference, which I'm sure we'll chat about here in just a moment on the podcast, was really focused on nature-based resiliency in urban settings. So Joe is very passionate about coastal resiliency work, and I'm very thrilled to have him share his experience here on the podcast and share just his passion on the work.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks, Sarah. Really excited to be here as well.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about today, but as you know, many of our listeners know too, we often start our podcast by asking our guests about their journeys, how they got to where they are today, why they do what they do. So I'd like to ask both of you to share a little bit about your backgrounds, what drives you, and what you're really, really passionate about. And Andrew, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, my background, I grew up in a pretty rural part of Louisiana. So, I spent a lot of time as a kid, kicking around in the woods. And that certainly, I think, helped flavor my pursuit of, the sciences and biology in particular. But as, I think back on my history, I think there were really two kind of capstone events in my life that happened to me that I think very firmly, set me on a path to pursue what I'm working on now in my career. And this, the first event, this kind of dates me a little bit, but as I was finishing up my undergraduate degree is when Hurricane Katrina hit in Louisiana. And so, shortly after that time period, I traveled down to New Orleans. I had some family there, and it really left an impression on me as I just saw the scale of destruction post-Katrina, and just chatting with people and just seeing, again, the immense power of nature. For me, it was kind of a humbling experience. I went on and pursued a master's in environmental toxicology, and then shortly thereafter got a job with a company. And very early on in the company, somebody came to me and asked me, "Hey, would you like to sign up for oil spill response?" And being a, young career person trying to get as many experiences as I could, I for sure agreed to. And a couple of days after I completed my training and got on the oil spill response team, is when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened. So very
Perfect
quickly, perfect timing. So that set off a chain of events in my life. Within 2 weeks of the oil rig, sinking and the oil rising from the bottom of the ocean, about a mile down, I was actually part of a team that went out to the incident site, 40 miles offshore. And again, it was another experience in my life where I got to see the scale and the scope of some of the problems that we're facing when you're looking on the horizon and see this weathered oil as far as the eye can see in the Gulf of Mexico. And just as a side note and a little bit of history, that team that I was on collected the very first oil sample from the riser pipe, and was later used as some of the fingerprint analyses for tracking that oil in the Gulf of Mexico. So those two events really, I think, shaped me. And I then pursued a PhD in wildlife and fisheries biology with an emphasis in environmental toxicology. And the reason why is because I realized, look, we have some really large scale challenges facing our nation, facing the globe. And I really wanted to understand and build a skill set in science and technology to provide solutions to those problems. And as I was at the conference with Joe and we were, having a chat, we, I think, both came to the conclusion that sometimes these events that are outside of our control kind of really shape, our careers and shape, our paths, if you will, in life.
It's so true. As you talk about, the oil spill, my early career was shaped in the chemical industry. I was working in the chemical industry. I wasn't very long out of school when the isocyanate accident in Bhopal, India happened. And it just completely changed the trajectory of my career. One of the first things I got to do was work with the chemical industry on building the whole responsible care ethic, guiding principles, all the core practices that they now have. It's the standard that is now followed by the chemical industry worldwide. But the big question was at the time, could this ever happen here? How do we keep people safe? So we're really shaped by our early experiences. And Joe, we want to hear about what you and Andrew were talking about in the off times of the conference about your early experiences and how it shaped what you're doing today.
Yeah, sure thing. We had very similar professional experiences that kind of shaped our career, but in different parts of the country and a little bit different timing as well. I grew up in Greater Boston, about 20 minutes north of the city, and was a journalism and political science undergrad, and had been working for, following undergraduate at a couple of different areas. I was communications director at a place called the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. Then I'd moved to New York and was working in workforce development, helping to build new career centers throughout the city and manage workforce development programs. And then got into a procurement innovation project with the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services. And while working on that project, Hurricane Sandy hit. And since the agencies that she led were responsible for a lot of the response work, our team was assisting with that. And so I, following a short FEMA training leading up to the storm, was helping a principal in a school in Astoria, Queens, run an evacuation shelter, and then spent a few days in the Emergency Operations Center in downtown Brooklyn, and then helped support the writing of some of the contracts that got FEMA into the city to help with the response efforts. And it really was a big career pivot for me, and it really changed the trajectory of my life. I'd always cared very much about communities that I lived in, throughout growing up and in high school and college, as well as always had a love of nature. And to see how sea level rise and coastal storms and climate change was just so profoundly affecting a city I love, people I love, and the nature there, it was heartbreaking, but it was also inspirational. And so I joined the recovery effort. I joined Mayor Bloomberg's team to help lead the recovery effort for the next 3 years, doing environmental assessment and feasibility work, leading a team that was working with homeowners and renters affected by the storm. And from there, went back to grad school to study environmental planning, and then came back home to Boston to get on the front end of climate resilience and work with the city of Boston as a senior resilience and waterfront planner, and really working on the Climate Ready Boston project that you'd mentioned before, which then led me to the Stone Living Lab, which we'll talk a little bit more about later too. But a very nonlinear path like Andrew, and one that I'm happy where we're at now and that we're able to connect in this way.
Very nonlinear, and both of your careers have been shaped by nature. And I think it's so interesting that both of your careers are around nature and nature-based solutions today. So that's really neat. I want to pick up and talk about coastal resilience in an urban environment like the Boston area and really what that entails. So I'm going to ask Andrew to set up the context a little bit for how the two of you from two very different organizations, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Stone Living Lab, how did you come together to be working on a common goal? What are the real challenges around creating coastal resilience in urban environments?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because, our built infrastructure on the coastal environments are this really interesting nexus between really critical infrastructure and risk associated with, coastal hazards. So we have this risk that we need to deal with. And so one of the big questions, that we have is how do we really buy down that risk, and what opportunities do we have to manage our infrastructure, manage these environments to really offset the risks that we have. And those risks are associated with the storm surge, all of the issues associated with the climate change imperative, the sea level rise. And so really one of the big questions that we have on our project and working with organizations like Stone Living Lab are questions around how do we better manage our environments to buy down these risks, and how do we incorporate not only this conventional infrastructure, but natural infrastructure, which our understanding is constantly growing of opportunities of how we can integrate that and better manage that to reduce these coastal risks.
So they're really complex challenges in urban environments, and especially for cities on coast like Boston. And I understand, Joe, that since 1991, Boston has experienced 21 major events that have triggered federal or state declarations of emergency. I mean, that's a lot of major events. So with climate change, we can expect to see a lot more of these events. And I guess from my perspective, what I'm hearing from you two is that building coastal resilience isn't a nice to do. It's really a must do.
That's exactly right, Sarah. Climate change is and will continue to increase coastal and riverine flooding as well as other hazards like stormwater flooding and extreme heat. And between those events that you mentioned and Hurricane Sandy having barely missed Boston, the city knew that they needed to prepare more for more events like this and for a changing climate. And so, Climate Ready Boston was launched in 2016. It's covering a range of climate hazards and vulnerability assessments, and looking at exactly what can be done throughout the city, working with community groups and residents and neighbors and consultants to be able to do this work. The reports have resulted in these coastal resilience solutions reports that cover the 47 miles of coastline and really look at exactly how the people and neighborhoods of Boston can adapt.
Indeed, the city of Boston also has to ensure that its people can adapt and that the vulnerable ecosystems they depend on are protected and able to adapt to changing conditions. And Andrew, as an example, maybe you could talk about some of the vulnerable salt marshes that you and your colleagues are working on in the area.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to step back a bit, thinking about salt marshes and why do we even care? I mean, we've known for a long time that salt marshes play a really critical role in flood risk management, taking the bulk of the energy from these storm surges that happen on the coastline. And we have observational data that date back, many, many years on this. There are scientific reports that date back even to the 60s. It's something that the Corps of Engineers has been looking at for a really long time. They've got a lot of data from the Gulf of Mexico, particularly for coastal Louisiana, where they're looking at how salt marshes have been beneficial to protecting the coast, protecting infrastructure on the coast. So the restoration and maintaining, these salt marshes is really critical to that flood risk management goal. And particularly in Boston, the Belle Isle Marsh is really a prime example of how a marsh in a very urbanized environment is providing benefit. And there's a lot of efforts in Boston with a lot of great collaborators, everything from local, state, federal partners to NGOs, to really make sure that we're protecting areas like Belle Isle Marsh and managing them in a way that provide a myriad of benefits, right? Not just flood risk management, but economic benefits, opportunities socially, as well as those ecosystem services that we care about. So from the Corps of Engineers perspective, we're really interested to better understand for regions like the Belle Isle Marsh, how do we understand and learn from them so we can apply this knowledge to other regions on the coastline that are frankly facing the same problems.
Joe, can you talk a little bit about why do these salt marshes matter? Why do they matter in the context of the Boston area?
Absolutely. I think Andrew did a good job of getting to that, and also just to build off that. I mean, salt marshes and all nature-based approaches to climate adaptation, whether currently existing and being protected through conservation and restoration, or through new projects that are helping to establish and grow them, they provide these co-benefits that gray infrastructure just does not. Salt marsh and other nature-based approaches, not only are providing that flood protection, but they're providing, essential habitat and biodiversity. They are supporting wildlife in a way that, gray infrastructure is not. They're helping with carbon sequestration, with stormwater management, with the heat island mitigation. They just provide all these co-benefits that are just really essential as cities try to adapt to these challenges.
Thanks. I think that helps, give us a bit bigger context. Andrew, maybe we could talk a little bit about Belle Isle and what you're doing there, because we had the opportunity to actually go and tour the salt marsh last year and experience some of the challenges that Belle Isle's facing firsthand.
Yeah, Belle Isle's a really interesting and beautiful place. If you've ever flown into Boston, just look outside the window. It's really a stone's throw away from the airport. So it's had a really interesting history, like a lot of marshes and wetlands that are near urban environments. Early 19th century, we tend to fill these areas up. We didn't really see the value in them. And Belle Isle was not, that different than a lot of regions in the country where we did this. So it had a lot of degradation, early 19th century. But in the 70s and 80s, through a coalition of people in Boston really banded together, saw the value of the marsh and began to restore it. and began to rehab that marsh and get it back to its functions and values that were beneficial.
Andrew, you were talking about critical habitat for, number of birds in Belle Isle. I mean, one of the things that we got to see firsthand was critical habitat for the endangered salt marsh sparrow.
Yeah, the salt marsh sparrow is a really interesting species. It's what we like to call a salt marsh specialist because it's completely spends its entire life in the salt marsh. And it's a species of special concern in Massachusetts. And it, to me, is a perfect example of almost the canary in the coal mine of some of the threats from sea level rise that are facing some species. The salt marsh sparrow, unfortunately, over the past few decades has really hit a pretty amazing population decline because it's pretty picky about its habitat.
I was stunned to learn that. It only likes one kind of salt marsh grass.
Exactly. And it's very picky in terms of when it breeds and is really influenced by tidal fluxes. So it's, again, a perfect example of some of the challenges that some of these species are facing as these coastlines are changing and some of the habitat is going away.
And Joe, you see Belle Isle as really part of a bigger, more critical ecosystem.
I mean, for exactly the reasons Andrew cited, it's just such a critical part of Boston's ecosystem and biodiversity and flood protection and needs to be protected and cared for. So the work of the Corps and engineering with nature is definitely aligned with the city's strategy to expand the use of green infrastructure, nature-based approaches, and other natural systems to manage stormwater, mitigate heat, and protect from coastal storms and flooding, and really provide all these additional benefits to people and nature.
So many urban cities on coast are facing similar challenges from sea level rise, flooding, extreme heat events, all the things that you two have been talking about. What can we learn from Boston and the surrounding areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot here to learn. I think, again, because Boston is on the forefront of this climate resiliency challenge, that we really need to take examples and take, a page out of, Boston's book, if you will, of how do we plan for, how do we study, how do we use science to inform our planning for risk reduction. So there's a lot of excellent partners that have been engaged in this problem for quite some time in Boston. And we need to learn from that because, again, these same challenges, even if you just look at the East Coast, these same challenges are facing so many cities. So everything that we can learn and now apply to other areas is value added from my perspective. Again, how do we learn from it? How do we adapt our science? How do we use that information to move forward with some of these other regions that are facing these similar challenges?
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about the work that your core colleagues are doing in the Boston area? I know they've been very, very involved in a number of studies.
Yeah, sure. They're currently partnering with the city of Boston as their non-federal partner to do a coastal storm risk management feasibility study. So that's really focused on looking at long-term potential impacts, 50 to 100 years out, to understand what regions are at risk within the greater Boston area. And then using that information, once we've identified these priority areas, areas with the highest risk factors, now what solutions can we apply to decrease those risks? And so that, again, is on this continuum of everything from conventional infrastructure to nature-based solutions, natural and nature-based features. So again, what we're targeting is how do we understand how to apply a broader spectrum of tools, right, like nature-based solutions to this problem.
And that's where you and Joe come together and and what you're working on and what your focus is going forward. So, Joe, building coastal resilience is really what you and your Stone Living Lab colleagues are dedicated to addressing. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about what your priorities are at Stone Living Lab and how your work is contributing to this broader Climate Ready Boston initiative.
So cities around the country and around the world are all adapting to sea level rise and coastal storms and the other risk factors associated with climate change that we've talked about, and especially with regards to sea level rise and coastal storms. Many of them are doing it using traditional seawalls and gray infrastructure, but the lab is here to really help provide better understanding of the effectiveness of nature-based approaches, of figuring out how these nature-based approaches can be incorporated into municipal climate adaptation plans. So we are doing research and monitoring work, education and engagement work, policy work, and climate preparedness work to really figure out and help provide better information, to provide cities with more tools in their tool belt to be able to adapt to climate change using these nature-based approaches and benefiting from the co-benefits that they provide.
Can you talk a little bit about what does Living Lab mean?
Boston Harbor is our laboratory, and really the Atlantic Ocean is. We are out in the field doing the research in an applied way with researchers, with partners, with residents. So it's really taking the work out of a traditional laboratory, as you may think about it, and doing it in the field.
Cool. So talk a little bit about the projects that you're working on now, because I know that you've got all different partners, including community members, involved in those.
Absolutely. So our research director, Paul Kirshen, is overseeing our 3 research projects we have this year. One of them is looking at living seawalls. This is in partnership with an organization actually called Living Seawalls, based out of Australia. So we're going to be installing 2 of those along the shores of Boston Harbor in coming months, and really looking at their effectiveness. We currently have a project in partnership with many other organizations looking at cobble berms at 6 different sites throughout eastern Massachusetts, and how cobble berms can really provide flood protection and the co-benefits that we talked about. And then we have a partnership with the City of Boston looking at real-time data to help better inform infrastructure decision-making projects. So pretty excited about these range of research projects, and they're complemented by an amazing range of education engagement projects led by Rebecca Shore, who's our education and engagement manager. Those include a teacher institute that we are working with 12 Boston area public school teachers to help them incorporate climate curriculum into their classrooms this fall, as well as a host of other programs throughout the rest of the year.
It sounds very exciting. I want to pull you back and ask you to tell us about what a living seawall is and what a cobble berm is. Because I'm not sure that all of our listeners are going to know what those terms are, Joe.
Sure thing. I think a lot of them may, but cobble berm, also referred to as a dynamic revetment. Think about a bunch of rocks on a beach that are helping to not only prevent erosion, but provide flood protection as well from coastal storms. And it actually reshapes, and that's the reason it's called dynamic, reshapes along with the storms. And so we're looking at how effective those can be in both urban and suburban areas throughout eastern Massachusetts. And then the living seawalls, these are panels that are affixed to traditional gray infrastructure. So it's not really a green infrastructure at its core, but it's making gray more green by having these custom crafted panels that are affixed to existing seawalls and can help with enhanced biodiversity, creating little areas for biodiversity to thrive, as well as helping improve water quality and having some wave break benefits as well. So two really cool projects that we're very, very excited about.
Yeah, and Joe, I get really excited as a biologist of this concept of living seawalls. I've always thought there's so much value left on the table with some of our traditional gray infrastructure that's just not being realized. And we have this, again, very interesting nexus between, a wall and the water, and so much opportunity there to promote habitat in some of these cases. So very exciting.
So, Joe, maybe you could talk a little bit about how the principles and practices of engineering with nature, nature-based solutions are being incorporated into your coastal resilience work beyond what you've just been talking about with the seawalls and your cobble berms.
That is why, engineering with nature is such a great partner, because the principles are just so closely aligned with the work the lab is doing. We're learning from engineering with nature on a regular basis, and we're able to do so at the conference that we had that I know we're going to talk about shortly as well.
All right. We need to talk about the conference. You've been hinting about it, both of you. We need to talk about the conference. So the Boston conference that we mentioned earlier was focused on creating nature-based coastal resilience in urban environments. And I understand it was the first official partnership between Stone Living Lab and the Army Corps of Engineers.
That's right. We were so excited to be hosting this conference. It was in April in Boston at UMass Boston. I didn't mention this at the top, but, the Stone Living Lab is a unique partnership between, federal, state, and local government, right? So we have, as well as a nonprofit and our research partner. So we have our two anchor partners, which are Boston Harbor Now and UMass Boston School for the Environment. Then we have the National Park Service, the state's Department of Conservation and Recreation, state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and the City of Boston coming together to form this partnership and really hosting this conference. And we were fortunate to finally be able to partner formally with Engineering with Nature and the Army Corps as well. Andrew as well as Jeff were on our coordination committee for the conference, both presented there as well. And we're just really thrilled to sort of formalize this partnership recently.
And you had a pretty good turnout, I understand. Better than you expected.
Yeah, we were hoping for about 200 people. We got 275 just from a range of fields and areas, both locally, around the region, and even some international participants, some residents from neighborhoods that were, right adjacent to where the conference was as well. And just, it was really nice to all come together and focus on equitable solutions to climate change.
So I want to hear about some of the key outcomes. Andrew, what would you say were some of the big takeaways for you?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I really observed during the conference was just the immense diversity of technical backgrounds, which I thought was extremely interesting. Because again, I think everything that we're working on with nature-based solutions is inherently multidisciplinary. So we really need all walks of life. We need the engineers, we need the biologists all sitting at the table to talk through some of these issues. And the Stone Living Lab was a perfect venue to have some of those conversations, both formally and informally. I mean, we had a combination of panels where we open forum, talked about these ideas, and had opportunities through breakout sessions, during socials to kind of get into the details more. So to me, that was really one of the biggest takeaways of just really the momentum that's growing for nature-based solutions is particularly exciting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Joe, what about you? What would you say the big takeaways were?
I think that was so well said by Andrew. I'll add to it just by, saying that everyone listening to this podcast, I'm sure, works in a pretty tough field, and it's so important to sort of avoid the doom and gloom, that can come with working on climate change, and instead focus on, the opportunities and the positivity and really embrace the way that we're all trying to work together on this. And so it was so nice to be able to come together in person and just learn from colleagues and learn from each other, but also just, share a cup of coffee with each other and actually hang out and share ideas about how to, collaboratively do this work in positive ways together.
Yeah, you're really building momentum. And I think and keeping positive, to your point, keeping focused on the opportunity. That's really neat. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you both, what's the bottom line here? What can we learn from the Boston examples and of urban climate resilience efforts? What are some of the things that our listeners can take away?
I think the role that stakeholder organizations like Stone Living Lab can play, and that collaboration is just essential to enable innovation and adaptation in this field. Nobody can do it alone, and being able to learn from each other, collaborate with each other is essential to doing this work together.
Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn here in Boston. It's got over 500,000 people in its population, 23rd largest city in the U.S. And with the people that, again, Stone Living Lab has brought together, with the people I've interacted with, there is such a great focus on trying to find solutions to some of these coastal hazard questions. So specifically, if you look at the arc of history with Boston, they have a lot of information, a lot of reports that they've put together over the potential projections for sea level rise and risk associated with that. And with this coastal storm risk management study that through partnership with the Corps of Engineers, there's really opportunities here to continue that understanding. And again, we're looking for solutions. So the city has an amazing focus on climate preparedness in terms of building urban resiliency, and it's very inspiring of them being very proactive. So let's understand this and let's actually take action. And so it's this great model that other cities can really look to, be inspired by, and apply.
Absolutely. Well, we need to wrap up this show. I want to thank you, Joe, very much for sharing a bit about your nonlinear journey, what inspires you, and talking about this really important work that you and your colleagues are doing at Stone Living Lab to help foster climate change adaptation and build resilience at the local level, and by involving a whole bunch of different stakeholders in the community. I hope that you and Andrew and your organizations find lots of opportunities to continue to collaborate together.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate you having us on the podcast, and this has been great. Thank you.
And Andrew, thanks for co-hosting this episode of the podcast and for letting us get to know you a little bit more and more about your work and the work that you and your colleagues are doing on coastal resilience in the Boston area.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. This was a lot of fun. And Joe, this has been great. And I love hearing these stories. So thank you.
Well, we might have to have you both back. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments about this episode or anything that we're working on in the Engineering with Nature program, please give us a call or drop us a note. Details are on the Engineering with Nature website. We're hoping that you've enjoyed this podcast, and we sure hope that you will join us again when we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN Podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN Podcast is produced by Eye Contact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.